After the collapse of the Third Reich, the women who were part of the SS faced various fates, ranging from arrests to public trials that exposed them as key figures in the Nazi apparatus. Among those tried, fewer than 100 received significant sentences, and only a small number were executed. Many others returned to civilian life under a veil of anonymity, hiding their past amid the chaos of the post-war period. Irma Grese was executed on the 13th of December 1945 for her cruelty as a guard at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. She was sentenced at the age of 22 following the Bergen-Belsen trial. On the gallows, Grese remained defiant to the end, impressing even the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint, who remarked on her composure and lack of remorse. Her last words before being hanged were simple but chilling, schnell, demanding that the process end immediately. The Iron Ladies, the female guards of Nazi camps. Healthy women aged between 20 and 40 are wanted for a military base, read a job advertisement published in a German newspaper in 1944. Good salaries and free food, housing and clothing are promised. What it did not mention was that the clothing would be an SS uniform and that the military site referred to the brutal concentration camps. There, female guards lived, some with their children. But from their dormitories, instead of pleasant landscapes, they saw chains of prisoners and the chimneys of gas chambers. Many of these young women came from poor families, had dropped out of school early, and had few professional opportunities. Working in a concentration camp meant a higher salary, comfortable housing, and economic independence. It was more appealing than working in a factory, said some young Aryan women. Many had been indoctrinated from an early age in Nazi youth groups and believed in Hitler's ideology. They felt they were supporting society by acting against its enemies. Around 3,500 women worked as guards in Nazi concentration camps, and all of them began their training in Ravensbrück. Many later worked in extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau or Bergen-Belsen, and became as feared and infamous as the SS men. The uniform granted them significant power over prisoners and even over other Germans. Ravensbrück was the largest concentration camp exclusively for women in Nazi Germany. Over 120,000 women from across Europe were imprisoned there. Many were resistance fighters or political opponents. Others were considered unfit for Nazi society. Jewish women, lesbians, sex workers, or homeless women. At least 30,000 women died there. Some were gassed or hanged, others succumbed to starvation, disease, or were worked to death. Many of the guards treated them brutally. They beat, tortured, or killed the prisoners. The inmates gave them nicknames such as Brigida the bloodthirsty, the bitch of Buchenwald, or even the angel of Auschwitz, referring to the beautiful Irma Grese, a young, attractive blonde who was found guilty of sinister murders and sentenced to death by hanging. The image of the blonde, sadistic woman in an SS uniform later became a sexualized cult figure in films and comics. However, out of the thousands of women who served as SS guards, only 77 were brought to trial, and very few were convicted. One such woman, Herta Bothe, was imprisoned for horrific acts of violence but was pardoned by the British after serving only a few years. In an interview shortly before her death, far from expressing remorse, she defended her actions, much like the sinister Ilse Koch, who took her own life and refused to accept responsibility for her gruesome crimes. Records show that some new recruits left the concentration camps as soon as they realized what the job entailed. They were allowed to leave without facing negative consequences. However, many others chose to stay, either because they needed the job or simply because they enjoyed it. In this video, we will discuss the latter case. Women are sometimes portrayed as exploited victims and at other times as sadistic monsters. The truth is more horrifying. They were not extraordinary monsters, but ordinary women who ended up committing monstrous acts. Although there were a few exceptions, women who managed to preserve some feminine tenderness amidst such cruelty. Brigida the bloodthirsty, the child killer, Hildegard Lechert. Her extreme brutality and the ferocity of her assaults earned her the nickname the Tigress, though other prisoners preferred to call her Brigida the bloodthirsty. This tall, broad-shouldered woman relished harming the inmates, who were too terrified to even meet her gaze. Most of her victims considered her a demon, as if some evil force had taken control of her mind and body. Even her facial expression would change when she felt the violent urge to beat or kill. This guard was the sadistic scourge of Nazi concentration camps, such as Majdanek and Auschwitz. However, after gaining her freedom, the surprise came when she became a CIA spy. Hildegard Martha Lechert was born on the 20th of January 1920 in Berlin. When the Nazis began their extermination machinery, Lechert worked as a nurse. Without ever being a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, she volunteered as a guard in the women's concentration camp at Majdanek. Her brutality quickly earned her the nickname the Tigress, and later Brigida the Bloodthirsty. Her successful Nazi career took her to the extermination center at Auschwitz, from which she fled in 1944 to avoid surrendering to the Soviets. When she spoke with SS men or her comrades, she was charming and very funny, but when she spoke to us and beat us, her face was horrible. "It wasn't the face of a woman," recalled a survivor of Majdanek. "She loved torturing Jewish women until the blood turned the area into a slaughterhouse." Her SS colleague, Christa Roy, described her as a sadistic and brutal bitch, and revealed that she enjoyed using a whip, lashing the backs and chests of inmates repeatedly. Although a mother of several children, she never allowed maternal instincts to interfere with her chilling thirst for violence. She tortured pregnant women and killed children in cold blood. At Majdanek, she gassed groups of more than 100 children. To carry this out, she gave them candy, gained their trust, and loaded them onto trucks that would take them to their deaths. During her last year as a guard, Lechert became pregnant. After giving birth to her third child, she was transferred to Auschwitz. She remained there until December of 1944. She stopped her torture only when she learned that the Soviet army was approaching, prompting her to flee. On the 24th of November 1947, Brigida the Bloodthirsty faced justice for the first time alongside 23 former SS members during the infamous Auschwitz trial. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison and incarcerated in a Krakow prison. She served only 9 of those 15 years, gaining her freedom in 1956. For many years, her whereabouts remained unknown, but her brutality was never forgotten. In November of 1975, Germany reopened her case and she stood trial again. The trial became one of the longest in history, concluding in June of 1981, when a court in Düsseldorf sentenced her to 12 years in prison. During the long proceedings, victims faced their tormentor, and chilling details of the Tigress's tortures emerged. Once again, she was released early. This time, she benefited from unexpected assistance. According to the German weekly Der Spiegel, Brigida the Bloodthirsty became a spy for both the American C-11A and the German Federal Intelligence Service. She was recruited to fight against the former Soviet Union, demonstrating that after World War II, Western intelligence agencies recruited not only male Nazi criminals but also women. Hildegard Lechert died in freedom in 1995 at the age of 75. The beautiful death, Irma Grese, the angel of Auschwitz. Not all female guards were the stereotypical terrifying Bavarian women. There was also a young woman as beautiful as she was brutal who became infamous as the angel of Auschwitz. Irma Ilse Ida Grese was born in 1923 into a dysfunctional family. At the age of 15, 2 years after her mother's death, she decided to drop out of school, feeling unmotivated. She worked at a dairy, on a farm, and in a hospital, where she studied nursing but did not graduate. She later worked as a cleaner at a clinic in Hohenlachen, where she met Dr. Karl Gebhardt, who would later be accused of performing surgical experiments on prisoners at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, and was tried in Nuremberg. Gebhardt took an interest in the young woman and encouraged her to persevere. One of Irma Grese's most striking traits, which she knew how to use to her advantage, was her exceptional physical beauty. She was a blonde with bright blue eyes and an apparent sweetness, but her face concealed a dark and sinister personality that terrified everyone who approached her. She was admired by many as if she were a movie star. Grese was vain and flirtatious, with wardrobes full of dresses from the most prestigious fashion houses in Paris, Vienna, Prague, Amsterdam, and Bucharest. Her allure was such that even fellow Nazis and prisoners would gaze at her for hours. In March of 1942, after a failed attempt and at the age of 18, Irma Grese successfully volunteered at the Ravensbrück camp. There, her career within the Nazi regime began. Ravensbrück, which housed up to 20,000 prisoners, became her new home. In addition to administrative duties, she became familiar with the harsh operations of the camp. Ravensbrück trained its female staff, about 3,500 women, who were later deployed to supervise other camps. Among them emerged some of the most infamous female guards, such as Ilse Koch, Hildegard Neumann, Dorothea Binz, and Maria Mandel. After this period of training in March of 1943, Grese was transferred to Auschwitz and assigned to Birkenau, where she initially managed supplies, mail, and roadwork units. Not yet 20 years old, her career continued to rise. By autumn of the same year, Grese was promoted to SS supervisor, making her the second highest-ranking woman in the camp after Maria Mandel. She oversaw approximately 30,000 female Jewish prisoners, primarily from Poland and Hungary. Her new responsibilities included direct control over the inmates and selecting individuals to be sent to the gas chambers. Later, during her trial, Grese, with remarkable cynicism, denied this, claiming she only heard of the mass executions from the prisoners themselves. The prisoners had to form rows of 5. It was my duty to ensure this. Then Dr. Mengele would come and make the selection, she stated during the Bergen-Belsen trial. Testimonies from survivors described in chilling detail the atrocities committed by the Angel of Auschwitz, a name that instilled fear simply by being mentioned. Survivors recounted that she walked the barracks in an impeccable uniform, her blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing heavy polished boots, armed with a whip and pistol. She was often accompanied by her dogs, always hungry and ferocious, that she unleashed on prisoners at her whim. One of her preferred methods of torture was to set the dogs on inmates to have them mauled. Another was cold-bloodedly shooting prisoners. Grese also used a braided whip to mutilate the breasts of women, particularly Jewish women with attractive figures, often leading to their deaths. One survivor testified, "She punched a woman in the face, and when the woman fell, she sat on her. Her face turned blue." The Angel tolerated no rivals to her beauty. Prisoners were treated as mere test subjects, subjected to any medical experiment that inflicted extreme suffering. According to one testimony, Grese even gouged out the eyes of a child she caught speaking to someone through the barbed wire fence. Sexual abuse and the humiliation of children were routine practices for her. The exact number of murders attributed to her in Birkenau's Block C is unknown, but investigations estimate an average of 30 murders per day, more than 30,000 over her career. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not the only camp to endure her cruelty. Between January and March of 1945, Grese returned briefly to Ravensbrück before being transferred to Bergen-Belsen, near Hanover, Germany. During the surrender in mid-April of 1945, Commander Josef Kramer negotiated with the British. Meanwhile, as Bergen-Belsen remained under German control, guards continued shooting prisoners attempting to escape. When the Allies arrived on the 15th of April, they found guards lined up impeccably uniformed. Among them was Grese, her angelic yet sinister face still exuding arrogance despite her deteriorated appearance. In September of 1945, Grese was tried along with Josef Kramer and 40 other officers for war crimes, including murder and mistreatment of prisoners at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. During a search of her residence, horrific trophies were discovered, lampshades made of human skin. She reportedly skinned and killed 3 Jewish prisoners with her own hands. Despite her conviction, Grese denied all murder charges, never renounced Nazi ideology, and even sang SS marching songs on the eve of her execution. On the 54th day of the trial, Irma Grese was found guilty of war crimes at Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. At 22 years old, she was sentenced to death by hanging. Her last words, as the noose was placed around her neck, were chillingly simple: "Let it be quick." Stick and gun, Herta Bothe, the sadist of Stutthof. Many women felt particularly empowered in their roles as camp guards, and Herta Bothe, known as the sadist of Stutthof, is a perfect example. A former nurse, Bothe worked as a guard in Stutthof, Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen. She was a ruthless and arrogant supervisor who would burst theatrically into barracks, shouting ominously to torment the prisoners whenever they failed to complete tasks properly, such as washing dishes or making beds. When tasks were not done with sufficient care, Bothe physically punished her victims, relishing the opportunity to intimidate, torment, and humiliate them. While most SS female guards were barely literate, Bothe stood out for her early work ethic and her initial interest in helping others. Her tireless industriousness meant that by the age of 17 in the year 1938, she held various jobs. She assisted her father in his small lumber shop in her hometown, worked temporarily in factories, and served as a nurse in an industrial hospital. Her behavior towards others was almost exemplary, until everything changed shortly thereafter. In the year 1939, Bothe joined the League of German Women, the female branch of the National Socialist Party. She found the organization's traditions inspiring. Over the next 3 years, her athletic skills and vitality impressed her superiors so much that in September of 1942, she was recruited as a guard at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. There, she underwent 4 weeks of training to join the camp's supervisory staff. It was at Ravensbrück that she met Irma Grese and Dorothea Binz, with whom she would later share inhumane crimes, bloody tortures, and heinous perversions. After 30 days at Ravensbrück, the young German woman began her terrifying career as a guard in her first post at the Stutthof concentration camp. Originally established by the Nazi regime as a civilian internment center under the control of the German secret police, Stutthof became a regular concentration camp in January of 1942. Located in a remote, damp and wooded area west of the small village of Stutthof, its setting was distinctive. Out of the 110,000 deportees who passed through, more than 85,000 perished due to catastrophic camp conditions, including starvation and disease, as well as daily executions by the camp's staff. In the year 1943, Stutthof was integrated into the Final Solution program, transforming it into a mass extermination camp. The camp became so overcrowded that many prisoners were sent directly to gas chambers upon arrival. Combined with the inhumane treatment inflicted by the guards, survival was nearly impossible. Herta Bothe was one of 130 women who served in the camp during its most tragic and cruel period. 34 of these female guards, including Bothe, were accused of crimes against humanity at the end of the war. Numerous witnesses testified that the sadist of Stutthof mercilessly mistreated prisoners, even shooting some in cold blood. She freely punished inmates by depriving them of bread or water for days. Her visits served no purpose other than to instill fear, humiliate, and often cause death. On the 21st of January 1945, at the age of 24, Bothe was promoted to Oberaufseherin, chief overseer. She became responsible for escorting the so-called death marches from central Poland to the German state of Lower Saxony. Prisoners were forced to walk approximately 700 kilometers on foot. During these grueling marches, the weakest often died from exhaustion, starvation, or abuse by their guards. The route to Bergen-Belsen included an additional detour of 600 kilometers to camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau, making the already unbearable ordeal even worse. 30 days after their departure, the prisoners arrived at Bergen-Belsen. Bothe eventually returned to Stutthof, which was liberated on the 9th of May 1945 by British troops. The soldiers discovered more than 10,000 corpses piled in open-air mass graves. Sadly, little could be done to save the surviving prisoners. The Allies forced the guards to bury the dead, and Bothe complied. As she later recalled in an interview, her greatest fear was contracting typhus while handling the corpses of Jewish victims. Prohibited from wearing gloves, Bothe focused on avoiding illness and insisted on frequent breaks. A light in the darkness, the horrors revealed in Bothe's trials. During the Belsen trial, held on the 17th of September 1945, testimonies began to shed light on the actions of Herta Bothe, revealing numerous atrocities. One of the first witnesses was Wilhelm Grunwald, a 17-year-old Czech survivor. After identifying Bothe in a photograph, he recounted a murder he witnessed. "I saw several very weak female prisoners carrying a food container from the kitchen to the block. As it was full and heavy, the women put it down to rest. I saw Bothe shoot both prisoners with her pistol. They collapsed," the young man testified. Another survivor stated about Bothe, "She beat us with all her strength as we passed through the door. We were so terrified of the beatings that we preferred to jump out the window." The testimony of Catherine Niger, a 23-year-old Czech woman, was key to identifying Bothe as one of the abusers and killers at Belsen. She explained that she often saw Bothe striking sick girls with a wooden stick. Niger was also tasked by the Nazis with recording the number of daily deaths in the camp. From January to the end of March of 1945, she documented 349 deaths, about 20 per day. However, this number was not accurate, as many deaths went unreported, and most bodies were left piled outside. In total, Niger estimated that about 900 women from her group died during that period. Another account also implicated Bothe in beatings with a heavy stick. Luba Trzynska, a Jewish prisoner from Russia, described Bothe's continuous mistreatment of inmates, particularly her brutal abuse as the sadist of Stutthof. On the 17th of November 1945, the court issued its verdict. Herta Bothe was found guilty of committing war crimes at Bergen-Belsen, including the mistreatment of prisoners under her supervision, which led to their deaths. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a lighter sentence compared to others like Maria Mandel or Irma Grese, who were executed. After serving 6 years in the cell prison, Bothe was released on the 22nd of December 1951 as an act of clemency by the British government. Her good behavior and the leniency of the British allowed her to leave behind her nightmare and begin a new life far removed from her Nazi past. Some reports suggest that the sadist of Stutthof married and changed her last name to Lange. This was a calculated effort to distance herself from her identity, ensuring that no one would recognize her, know what she had done during the war, or why she had been imprisoned. It could be said that she succeeded in her goal, to diminish her culpability by arguing that men were the only gears in Hitler's machine, the sole ones giving orders. At 79 years old, living in a modest community in northwestern Germany, Herta Bothe gave an interview. When asked about her heinous actions, she responded, "What do you mean? Did I make a mistake?" "No." "I'm not sure what I should answer. Did I make a mistake?" Number. "The mistake was the concentration camp, but I had to do it. Otherwise, they would have put me there. That was my mistake." After the fall of Nazism, she lived a secluded life, remaining silent and avoiding attention. When she did speak out with those infamous statements, the wound of the Holocaust reopened. Her exaggerated theatrics during the trial had earned her freedom, but never genuine remorse. To this day, her name remains synonymous with infamy. The sinister goddess of depravity, Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald. Margaret Ilse Köhler was born in the year 1906 in Dresden. After the First World War, like many Germans, she struggled to make a living during the economic crisis. She worked in factories and various shops until, in the year 1932, she joined the National Socialist Party, as did many others at the time. This early affiliation brought her benefits. When the Nazis came to power, her position improved. A few years later, she was given an administrative role at Sachsenhausen, one of the first concentration camps. Heinrich Himmler thought the young woman was charming and attractive, so he introduced her to the camp's director, Karl Otto Koch, and suggested that they become a couple. They obliged and married shortly thereafter. Ilse then became Ilse Koch, the secretary and first lady of the concentration camp. Karl Otto Koch was an ambitious and unscrupulous man, acting without limits or accountability. As Hitler's regime expanded its network of camps and intensified the killings, Koch was appointed commander of Buchenwald a few years before the war began. He established the camp and exercised absolute authority. Nearly 250,000 prisoners passed through Buchenwald, and more than 25% were killed. The camp had no gas chambers, but deaths from starvation, disease, abuse by guards, and arbitrary executions were widespread. Karl Otto and Ilse Koch enjoyed a life of luxury. They built a lavish mansion, furnished with the finest furniture and art stolen from Jewish families. Their megalomania was exemplified by the zoo they created inside the camp, filled with exotic plants and animals brought from all over the world. Ilse Koch was far more than just the wife of the camp commander. Most wives of Nazi officials remained at home raising children and maintaining an illusion of normalcy for their families. But Ilse was different. She actively participated, flaunting her energetic arrogance and fiery red hair as she issued orders throughout the camp. Her presence instilled a deep and justified fear. As the First Lady of Buchenwald, was ruthlessly cruel. During post-war trials, witnesses described her as a nymphomaniac, claiming her sexual appetite was insatiable. Several accounts, including those from Germans and SS officers, stated that she organized macabre orgies in the couple's mansion. Ilse recruited participants from the neighboring town, among SS officers, soldiers, and their wives. But these testimonies revealed even darker activities. Prisoners were forced to perform sexual acts to satisfy her voyeuristic tendencies or simply to alleviate her boredom. Those who failed to meet her expectations were mocked or beaten. No one dared look her in the eye or contradict her. Doing so meant immediate execution. At other times, she would grope prisoners or expose her breasts, punishing those who failed to show arousal. Her behavior earned her nicknames like the Witch of Buchenwald and the Red Bitch, the latter inspired by her attitude and red hair. Ilse Koch personally whipped and tortured prisoners who did not meet her demands. She carried a club at her waist, tipped with razor blades. One of her favorite games involved locking 20 prisoners in a pen and releasing wild dogs. As the prisoners ran for their lives, being bitten to death, Ilse's laughter echoed from meters away. But this pales in comparison to her most sinister hobby. Witnesses testified that Ilse ordered executions with specific instructions to avoid damaging certain areas of the victim's skin, which she intended to keep as trophies. One of her lovers, Valdemar Hoven, a doctor overseeing medical experiments at Buchenwald, helped Ilse carry out this horrific practice. They would strip new arrivals, selecting those with the most striking tattoos, who were then shot in the back of the head to preserve their skin. Several human skin fragments with tattoos were found at Buchenwald, as well as lampshades allegedly made from human skin, although definitive evidence linking these to Ilse was lacking. The Koch couple's excesses eventually sparked backlash even within the Nazi regime. Their opulence and behavior became a topic of gossip among high-ranking officials. The deaths of 2 Buchenwald doctors prompted an internal investigation. Karl Otto claimed they were spies attempting to escape, but the investigation revealed another motive. The doctors had treated Koch for syphilis, and he had them killed to keep the secret. Despite this, their careers were not immediately derailed. Himmler reassigned Karl Otto to command Majdanek, where a brutal leader was needed. However, Ilse remained at Buchenwald, continuing to behave as if no law other than her own existed. The end of the nightmare, the fate of Karl Otto and Ilse Koch. A few months later, in an attempt to cover up a massive escape of Soviet prisoners of war, Karl Otto Koch ordered a massacre that only succeeded in drawing attention to his incompetence and lack of control. He was removed from his position and sent to an administrative post in Berlin, though he was later reassigned to Buchenwald. Upon his return, he behaved as he always had. His downfall came during a visit from his protector, Heinrich Himmler. The SS leader discovered that while Germany was crumbling, the Kochs were living in luxury. It was easy for the party to accuse them of embezzlement, immorality, and theft. Not even the impending Nazi defeat could save Koch. He was tried in the same concentration camp he had commanded, sentenced to death, and executed in early April of 1945, just 1 week before the Allies liberated Buchenwald. Ilse, however, was not condemned at that time and managed to escape before the enemy's arrival. She sought refuge in the western part of Berlin, far from the reach of Soviet forces. When she was later arrested after the war, evidence of the atrocities committed during her years at Buchenwald overwhelmed the magistrates. She was tried during the so-called Dachau trials alongside other women and sentenced to life imprisonment. She avoided the death penalty because she was pregnant. The father of the child was unknown, and her accusers suspected she had become pregnant intentionally to escape the gallows. After the baby, a boy, was born, he was given up for adoption. Later, General Lucius Clay, the American governor of the U.S. zone in Germany, reduced her sentence to 4 years of imprisonment. In 1951, she was arrested and tried again, this time for crimes committed against German citizens. This trial garnered significant public attention. Although the horrors of the Nazi regime were already widely known, Ilse Koch's case introduced new elements. The accused was a woman, there were sinister sexual components, and the sadism and suspicions surrounding the use of victims' skin fascinated the press. She was accused of responsibility for approximately 5,000 deaths, among the 56,000 that occurred at Buchenwald during those years. The Nazi doctors at the camp were very interested in human skin. Ilse constantly encouraged them to continue their experiments and procedures. They would remove the skin, treat it with chemicals, and leave it to dry in the sun. You could see it as you walked by, testified a Czech doctor sent to Buchenwald by the Gestapo. The skin was used to make gloves, wallets, lampshades, and even to bind books. Tattooed skin was especially prized, and these fragments could not come from Germans, so the victims were mostly Soviets, Poles, and Roma people. Since the skin needed to be in good condition, the emaciated bodies of prisoners who had suffered long-term confinement or torture were of no use. Often, Ilse ordered newly arrived prisoners to be killed just to ensure their corpses would yield high-quality skin. During the trial, Koch's presence was erratic, as she frequently experienced panic attacks and hysterical episodes. Her screams, fits of nerves, and fainting spells, whether genuine or feigned, interrupted proceedings numerous times. Occasionally, in the middle of a survivor's testimony, Ilse Koch would stand and shout, "Yes, I am guilty. I am responsible for everything. I am a sinner." Her constant interruptions delayed the trial, and the court allowed her to remain in her cell for much of the process. The sentencing was brief. She was condemned to life imprisonment. Those in the courtroom and the crowd waiting outside reacted with outrage, and there were fears of a riot. The public had become deeply invested in Koch's case, demanding the death penalty and demanding to see the lampshades and gloves made from human skin. This did not happen. Ilse Koch lived out an infamous sentence, even within the prison. Other inmates despised and mistreated her. The woman who once ruled over a concentration camp descended further into madness. Her screams tormented her fellow prisoners. They began at night but eventually occurred at any hour. Ilse was convinced that a commando group of camp survivors and relatives of her victims was trying to infiltrate the prison to kill her. Her paranoia only grew, persisting for years. In 1961, Ilse Koch wrote a letter to her son Uwe, declaring that she felt no remorse for her crimes. Shortly thereafter, she tied several sheets to a lamp and hanged herself. She left behind a note that read, "There is no other way out for me. Death is the only liberation." The benevolent anomaly, Johanna Langefeld, the guardian angel of Ravensbrück. To conclude, we'll examine a unique case, the only female guard remembered fondly by survivors of Ravensbrück. According to rumors, she even received help from the camp's former prisoners to escape prison. This is the story of Johanna Langefeld, known as Our Lady Guardian of Ravensbrück. Born in Essen, Germany, Johanna Langefeld grew up in a nationalist and Lutheran family. In 1924, she moved to Mülheim and married Wilhelm Langefeld, who passed away in 1926 due to a pulmonary obstruction. In 1928, Langefeld became pregnant by another man and moved to Düsseldorf, where her son was born in August of the same year. Unemployed until the age of 34, Langefeld began teaching home economics at a business school in Neuss. By 1935, she was working as a guard in a work institution, a reformatory for prostitutes, the unemployed, homeless women, and other individuals labeled as asocial. Later, these individuals would be sent to labor or concentration camps. Langefeld joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and in March of 1938 was recruited as a guard at the first SS concentration camp for women in Lichtenberg. Her work was exemplary, and after a year, Langefeld was promoted to superintendent of the camp. In May of 1939, she was transferred to Ravensbrück, where she served as the assistant to the camp's preventive custody leader. At Ravensbrück, Langefeld oversaw selections during the so-called 14F13 murder campaign, which aimed to eliminate sick or unfit prisoners before the implementation of the final solution. It was during this time that Langefeld began to show her more humane side. She not only avoided punishments but also destroyed reports submitted by guards and officials that could have led to severe consequences for prisoners. This was confirmed by Polish survivor Józefina Węglarska. She destroyed criminal complaints, was reluctant to enforce punishments, and always allowed prisoners to explain themselves. She added, "She was very calm and never raised her voice at us." Another recorded incident occurred on the 18th of March 1943, when 8 women were about to be executed. Before the shots rang out, they and other prisoners shouted, "Long live Poland!" causing an uproar in the camp. The SS officers were enraged, and the Polish prisoners expected severe retaliation. However, to everyone's surprise, no punishment followed. It was later revealed that Langefeld had negotiated with the camp authorities to replace executions with the punishment of making the women stand for an entire day, a far less cruel fate than the usual tortures. In mid-March of 1942, Langefeld was assigned to the new women's building at Auschwitz, where she had to select prisoners to be sent to the gas chambers. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, believed that Frau Langefeld lacked the ability to control the situation and refused to follow instructions from the preventive custody leader. Surprisingly, Höss decided to place the women's camp entirely under her jurisdiction. During a visit by SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler on the 18th of July 1942, Langefeld tried to persuade him to revoke the order, but Himmler refused. He insisted that Langefeld remain in charge of the women's camp and ordered that no male SS officer should enter the female camp in the future. That same month, the women's camp at Auschwitz was moved to Birkenau, 3 kilometers away. 2 weeks later, Langefeld suffered a knee injury and required cartilage surgery at the SS sanatorium in Hohenleichen, near Ravensbrück. While recovering, she convinced her superiors to transfer her back to Ravensbrück, where she felt more at ease. Upon her departure, Maria Mandel took over at Auschwitz, which was disastrous for the prisoners, as Mandel, unlike Langefeld, was inhumanly cruel. Back at Ravensbrück, Langefeld showed even more compassion toward the prisoners. Margarete Buber-Neumann, a communist prisoner who became Langefeld's assistant, recalled that Langefeld was removed from her position for being excessively sympathetic toward Polish prisoners. Separated from her son, Johanna was arrested in Breslau, where an SS tribunal prepared a case against her. However, she was never tried due to the collapse of Nazism at the war's end. On the 20th of December 1945, Langefeld was arrested by the United States Army and extradited in September of 1946 to Poland, where the judiciary prepared a trial in Krakow against SS personnel from Auschwitz. On the 23rd of December 1946, Johanna Langefeld was sent to clean apartments designated for new employees of the penitentiary. She never returned. According to later accounts, Langefeld escaped with the help of Polish prisoners who had survived Ravensbrück and respected her as a guardian. Johanna Moskowska-Penson, a survivor of the camp, was convinced that only former Ravensbrück prisoners could have helped Langefeld. The women in Krakow knew the city well, knew who to ask for help, and likely bribed the guards. That's why no one stopped her from leaving. Otherwise, her escape would have been impossible. Reportedly, Langefeld hid in a local monastery for some time and worked as a caretaker in a private home. By the middle of 1957, she had returned illegally to live with her sister in Munich. Langefeld died in freedom at the age of 73, as one of the few Nazi officials remembered kindly by her prisoners. Thank you for following us to the end. If you enjoyed our content, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you next time.